In 2023, amid a modern America flooded with data, DNA, and surveillance technology, a chilling miracle unexpectedly occurred after 17 years of silence. A boy who had vanished from New Hampshire at the age of 5 was confirmed to be still alive, grown up, existing in society, and completely unaware that he had once been the center of a missing person case that haunted an entire community. Just a short time before that, the truth hit his life like an unavoidable collision. The name he carried was not his real one. The family he called home was not his biological family, and the seemingly normal childhood was actually built on deliberately concealed voids. Today, I will plunge you straight into the eye of the storm of a cold case that spanned nearly 2 decades, what really happened on that fateful morning in 2006, how a child could disappear from the system without leaving a trace, and why no one recognized that he was growing up right in front of them. This is not just a disappearance, it is a story about stolen identity, about the dangerous silence of unmatched records, and about the fragile boundary between protection and deprivation. This is one of the rare true crime journeys where hope and obsession exist side by side, where the victim is not lying in a grave, but stands up to confront his own past. You are the most important witnesses to this story, so take a deep breath. Right now, we will step into the journey that will make you wonder, if this could happen to Mark, could it happen to anyone else? Before diving deep into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys into forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. In 2006, New Hampshire was still considered one of the most peaceful states in New England, where small towns existed with a slow pace of life, crime rarely appeared on the evening news, and most families believed that the worst things would not happen right in front of their own homes. Laconia, a town near Lake Winnipesaukee, embodied all those characteristics: narrow roads, familiar neighborhoods, children riding bikes around the block without adults hovering nearby. In that setting, the Lewis family lived a life that had nothing noteworthy to draw anyone's attention. Daniel Lewis worked fixed hours, Rebecca Lewis managed the household and cared for her husband's son from a previous relationship. Mark Lewis, the 5-year-old boy with a small build, light-colored hair, and a habit of clinging to the familiar. Mark was not a hyperactive child, or one who liked to break rules. He was accustomed to fixed routines, mornings that repeated the same way, and he especially trusted the adults around him. Among them was a figure that the Lewis family treated as part of their daily routine, a familiar neighbor who often kept an eye on Mark every morning when he left the house to go to his usual spot in the neighborhood. That trust was not built in a single day, but accumulated over time, through nods of greeting, brief watching over him, and the feeling that everyone knew everyone in this small community. That morning began no differently from the days before: moderately cold late winter weather, pale light spreading over the rooftops, Mark eating breakfast, preparing to leave the house as usual without any sign that his life was about to veer in a different direction. When Mark stepped outside, everything was still within the realm of normal, to the point that no one felt the need to pay too much attention. It was precisely that familiarity that let small details slip by without being retained. In that brief period, an unusual element appeared, not clear enough to be seen as a threat, but also not entirely fitting the everyday scene: a stranger, or an unfamiliar situation, passing through the view of the key witness. The initial reaction was not alarm, but a very human hesitation, a moment of wondering, and then reassuring oneself that it was probably just a coincidence, that there was no reason to suspect anything in a town as peaceful as this. It was in that moment of hesitation that Mark slipped out of the control of the adults around him, without leaving any clear sign. There was no cry for help, no struggle fully witnessed, just a gap of a few minutes that in retrospect, no one could pinpoint exactly what had happened in it. The mistakes leading to this moment did not carry clear guilt, but stemmed from habit, from trust, and from the common belief that bad things usually happen elsewhere, to other people. When Mark did not appear on schedule, the Lewis family began to sense the first unease, initially confusion, then quickly turning to worry, as calls and looks around the neighborhood yielded no answers. Daniel and Rebecca split up to search, calling Mark's name, checking the most familiar places before expanding the area, but each passing minute only made one thing clearer. The boy was nowhere within their reach. That spontaneous search carried all the elements of desperation, fragile hope that Mark was just lost somewhere nearby, mixed with growing fear as no sign confirmed it. Finally, when personal efforts no longer yielded results, the Lewis family was forced to make the decision no one wants to make in such circumstances. Contact the police to report Mark missing, marking the moment when an ordinary morning in Laconia officially ended and opened a void lasting many years in the lives of everyone involved. Immediately after the Lewis family's missing person call, the incident was quickly removed from the realm of relative spontaneous efforts and officially entered the system of official agency response, where every decision had to follow established procedures for cases of children with unknown whereabouts. Mark Lewis's missing person file was opened that same day, classified as a case involving a young child with high priority, though at that point there was not yet enough evidence to determine it was an abduction. Opening the file was not just administrative, but the starting point for the entire chain of subsequent actions, from allocating personnel, establishing the investigation scope, to the methods of collecting and processing initial information. At the local police department, an investigation team was assigned to handle the case, including officers directly accessing the scene, an investigator responsible for compiling information, and a liaison with the victim's family, to ensure two-way information flow was not interrupted in the first hours. This assignment happened quickly, but could not avoid the inherent limitations of a local unit, where resources were not abundant, and many officers had to share duties across different cases. On the same day, investigators began gathering the hottest information, focusing on what had happened in the morning before Mark disappeared, from the moment he left the house until the family noticed the unusual absence. Questions centered on daily habits, regular relationships, people who might have seen Mark, and any detail, no matter how small, that could help reconstruct the final minutes when he was still in the community's view. This information was recorded simultaneously from the family, from key witnesses, and from neighboring households, creating an initial picture that was still fragmented, but necessary to determine the next direction of the investigation. In the process, an important verification step was carried out almost immediately, contacting the school and Mark's usual daily activity spots to confirm whether he had appeared anywhere according to schedule or not. The results quickly showed that Mark did not go to school that day, ruling out the possibility that he had gone off on a different route on his own, but still completed his normal activities, while reinforcing the assessment that the disappearance had occurred before, or in the very short time after he left the house. Based on the initial information, the disappearance area was circled in a narrow scope around the residential area where the Lewis family lived, focusing on familiar routes, turns, and points a 5-year-old child could reach in a short time. This circling was not only for search purposes, but also to help identify people who might have been near Mark at the critical time, thereby building a list of subjects to contact and work with in the early stage. Throughout the first day, investigators faced enormous time pressure, because in child disappearance cases, every passing hour could reduce the chances of finding the victim safely. However, that pressure went hand in hand with a lack of specific data, as the scene provided no clear signs and initial accounts were largely based on unverified memories. All information gathered on the first day was temporary, needing cross-checking and filtering, but still played a pivotal role in shaping how authorities viewed the case. Activating the emergency investigation was thus not just a procedural reflex, but a decisive shift, where Mark Lewis's fate was no longer in the hands of family and neighbors, but placed into an investigation system, trying to race against time, with the hope that the initial clues, no matter how fragile, could still lead to an answer before everything became too late. After the emergency investigation was activated, and the hottest information from the first day was collected, the focus of authorities quickly shifted to building as accurate a timeline as possible for the morning Mark Lewis disappeared, because in child disappearance cases, determining the last place and circumstances the victim was seen is often the most important key to unlocking subsequent investigation directions. Investigators started by systematizing all the time markers mentioned scattered in the initial accounts, from the moment Mark left the house, the following minutes when he appeared in adults' view, to when the family realized the unusual absence. Determining the last time Mark was seen relied not on a single source, but had to synthesize from multiple different statements, including the family, key witnesses, and some residents living along the routes Mark might have taken. Each statement was recorded with estimated time, location, and specific context, forming a series of pieces that the investigator's task was to place in the right position within a reasonable time frame. In this process, direct witnesses were prioritized for early work, as their memories were still relatively fresh and less influenced by media information or community discussions. Interviews focused on seemingly trivial details, like direction of movement, observation distance, time paused, or initial reaction to what they saw, because these factors could make a big difference when comparing and cross-referencing statements. When the accounts were placed side by side, points of similarity began to emerge, helping confirm some basic time markers, but at the same time revealing unavoidable differences, especially regarding the sequence of events and the time between actions. Some witnesses believed Mark had left the house a few minutes earlier than the family's estimate, while others remembered him appearing at a position where, according to previous accounts, he should no longer have been there at that time. These discrepancies did not necessarily mean someone was lying, but reflected the imprecise nature of human memory, especially in situations not seen as unusual at the time they occurred. However, for investigators, these discrepancies forced them to be more cautious when determining hard time markers, because an inaccurate timeline could lead to pursuing wrong investigation directions from the start. Through comparison and cross-referencing, investigators gradually narrowed down the time frame in which Mark might have disappeared, determining that the incident most likely occurred in a short span of just a few minutes, lying between when he left the house and the time he was supposed to appear at his usual activity location. This critical time gap became the focus of the entire investigation effort, as it represented the moment when every possibility, from Mark getting lost, having an accident, to being led away by someone else, could have happened without leaving clear traces. Identifying that gap also allowed authorities to start ruling out some less likely scenarios, such as Mark voluntarily moving far from the area in a very short time, which did not fit the abilities and habits of a 5-year-old child. Based on the reconstructed timeline, Mark's disappearance area was significantly narrowed, focusing on a small zone within the residential area, where routes intersected, and visibility was obscured by houses, trees, or auxiliary structures. This narrowing was not just geographical, but also helped investigators more clearly identify who might have been in that area at the exact critical time, thereby prioritizing resources for approaching and working with related individuals. However, even though the timeline was built with the highest possible detail at that time, it still had gaps that could not be filled with direct evidence, as there were no surveillance cameras, no technical data support, and most statements were based on subjective estimates. This lack made the timeline both the most important tool and the biggest limitation of the investigation in the early stage, when every conclusion had to be placed in a temporary state and ready for adjustment if new information emerged. In that context, building the timeline and determining the disappearance point did not provide an immediate answer to the question of where Mark had gone, but it laid the foundation for all subsequent steps turning a vague disappearance into a structured sequence of events, where every second was weighed as an important piece in the incomplete picture of the case. Once the critical time gap had been identified through reconstructing the timeline, the investigators moved to the next phase with the expectation that the physical scene might provide answers that human memory could not. Because in many child disappearance cases, the smallest traces left behind at the location of the incident are often the decisive factors in clarifying the nature of the case. The search began at the Lewis family home, where Mark lived, and which was the starting point for all investigative hypotheses. The house was approached as a potential crime scene, even though there were no initial signs that the incident had occurred inside, because definitively ruling out this possibility was mandatory before expanding the scope outward. The investigators examined each area of the house in sequence, from the common living spaces to Mark's bedroom, paying attention to the arrangement of furniture, the condition of doors and windows, and the boy's everyday personal items. The goal of this examination was not only to look for signs of a struggle or violent act, but also to determine whether there was any interruption in the morning routine that might have been overlooked in the family's account, such as items unusually taken, signs of haste, or small changes inconsistent with daily habits. However, the results showed that the house remained in its familiar state, with no furniture disturbed, no indications that Mark had been prevented from leaving or had encountered an issue before exiting, which reinforced the assessment that the disappearance most likely occurred after he stepped out of the family living space. After completing the exclusion of the possibility that the incident took place inside the house, the focus of the search shifted to Mark's usual daily route, which was considered the area with the highest probability of something happening during the brief time period previously identified. The route was not long, but for a 5-year-old child, it included many familiar stopping points, sections where Mark often slowed down, places that could distract him, or temporarily cause him to deviate from the main path. The investigators walked the route multiple times at different times of day to assess lighting conditions, visibility, and the level of activity in the area, in order to identify any spots secluded enough for an unusual event to occur without being noticed by others. During this process, they noted environmental features such as low fences, side paths between houses, vacant lots, and areas with dense foliage, as these were locations that could obstruct visibility for a few minutes, matching the critical time gap indicated by the timeline. Concurrently with examining the route, nearby areas were also systematically swept, including the homes of the nearest neighbors, shared parking lots, side roads leading out of the residential area, and little-used trails. This sweeping aimed to determine whether Mark could have left the main area in some way, or if there were signs that he had been taken into a vehicle during that brief period. However, due to the characteristics of the area being a quiet residential neighborhood with few surveillance cameras and low traffic volume, the ability to collect physical evidence from passing vehicles was very limited. Throughout the search process, the investigators paid special attention to physical signs that might remain on the ground and surrounding surfaces, including small footprints, tire tracks, drag marks, or any objects not belonging to the natural environment of the area. Such signs, if present, could help determine Mark's direction of movement or clarify whether there had been intervention by another person. Yet, the sweeping results showed no clear signs of this kind, partly because weather conditions and daily activity in the neighborhood could have blurred or erased faint traces in a short time. This absence of physical evidence led to the scene being assessed as clean in professional terms, meaning it provided no direct clues to determine what had happened, but it also raised difficult questions about the nature of the disappearance. A clean scene could mean there was no criminal act, but it could also indicate that if there was intervention by another person, the action had occurred quickly, deliberately, and without leaving easily detectable traces. The lack of physical clues forced the investigators to reconsider the initial hypotheses, particularly the possibility that Mark had voluntarily followed a familiar person or a stranger he did not fear, because in this scenario, the absence of signs of struggle or panic would be understandable. At the same time, It made relying on witness statements and behavioral analysis more important than ever, as those were almost the only remaining sources of information for reconstructing the event. When compiling all the search results, from the home, the daily route, to the surrounding areas, the investigators were compelled to reach a provisional conclusion that the scene did not provide sufficiently strong physical evidence to determine the cause or mechanism of the disappearance. This conclusion was not the end of the investigation, but it marked an important turning point, because from this point onward, finding Mark Lewis would no longer rely on what the scene had left behind, but would have to depend on analyzing people, behavior, and the decisions that took place during the brief but decisive period on the morning the boy vanished. The crime scene search yielding no specific physical clues forced the investigators to shift focus to building and testing initial hypotheses, because in a traceless disappearance, systematic elimination is often the only path to getting closer to the truth. The first hypothesis raised, and the most common in child disappearances in peaceful residential areas, was the possibility that Mark had wandered off the familiar route on his own. The investigators seriously considered this based on precedent, Mark's age, and the characteristics of the surrounding area, while checking whether the boy had ever previously left the permitted area, shown excessive curiosity toward dangerous spots, or mentioned wanting to go somewhere alone. However, when comparing this hypothesis to the collected data, many mismatched elements gradually became clear. Mark was not a rule-breaking child. He was accustomed to following a fixed route, and there were no signs that he had prepared for a longer trip than usual, either psychologically or with personal items. Moreover, the search radius around the residential area, though not covering every nook and cranny, was sufficient to rule out the possibility that Mark had wandered far without leaving any trace, especially in the very short time period identified. Alongside the wandering hypothesis, the possibility that Mark had an accident was also added to the list for consideration, particularly accidents that could happen quickly and be hard to detect, such as falling into a concealed area or encountering an issue in a nearby natural space. The investigators reviewed environmental factors that could pose danger to a 5-year-old child, including areas with water, uneven terrain, or abandoned structures, while cross-referencing with initial search results to see if there were signs of such an incident. However, like the wandering hypothesis, the accident possibility gradually lost persuasiveness when no supporting physical evidence emerged. No personal items were left in locations suggesting an accident, and no witness statements indicated Mark had been near dangerous areas at the critical time. As the two most common hypotheses began to weaken, the investigators were forced to consider a more concerning scenario, the possibility that Mark had been abducted randomly. This hypothesis was based on the reality that in a very short time frame, a child could be led away without drawing attention, especially if the perpetrator did not use violence and did not create an unusual scene. The investigators analyzed similar cases that had occurred in the New England area, examining patterns in random child abductions, including approaches to victims, chosen timing, and methods of leaving the scene. However, when comparing this hypothesis to the actual facts of the Mark Lewis case, difficulties immediately arose. No witnesses directly confirmed Mark being forced or led away, no signs of struggle, no clearly identified unfamiliar vehicle, and no ransom demand or contact appeared afterward. This did not completely rule out abduction, but it made the hypothesis hard to prove and pursue in the early stage, when all resources had to be allocated cautiously. In the process of comparing hypotheses to actual data, the investigators continually returned to firmly confirmed elements, such as the very short disappearance time frame, the traceless scene, and Mark's prior behavior, to check which hypothesis best fit the overall picture. Each hypothesis was subjected to the same evaluation standard, not based on emotion or the frightening nature of the scenario, but on its reasonable ability to explain what was known and what remained unexplained. Through this process, weaker possibilities were gradually eliminated, not by a decisive ruling, but by acknowledging that they lacked the strength to cover all existing data. Elimination was not final, as in investigations, a hypothesis ruled out today could be reconsidered with new information, but it helped narrow the scope of speculation and prevent the investigation from becoming unfocused and scattered. By the end of this phase, the investigators had to accept a difficult reality. No hypothesis fully matched what had been confirmed, and that very lack of fit became a worrying sign, suggesting that Mark Lewis's disappearance might not follow the usual patterns that authorities typically encounter. This initial impasse did not mean the investigation had reached a dead end, but it marked an important shift, where initial assumptions were no longer sufficient to guide the process, and the investigators had to prepare for delving deeper into more complex possibilities, requiring more time, resources, and patience to take another step toward discovering what really happened to Mark on that morning in 2006. When common hypotheses such as wandering off accident or random abduction all failed to fully explain what had occurred, the investigation was forced to turn to a more sensitive but unavoidable area in any child disappearance case: the circle of people most familiar with the victim, because statistics and experience show that the majority of such cases involve individuals with high access, rather than completely random acts by strangers. The first step in this phase was compiling a list of everyone who could have had access to Mark Lewis in the days, and especially the morning, before he vanished, including family members, relatives, nearby neighbors, family friends, informal babysitters, and any individuals who regularly appeared on Mark's daily route. This list was not intended to immediately identify a specific suspect, but to ensure that no one with significant access was overlooked simply because they were considered familiar or safe in the community's eyes. In compiling the list, the investigators paid special attention to everyday but overlooked relationships, because that very familiarity can sometimes create favorable conditions for access without raising suspicion. Once the initial list was complete, focus quickly shifted to the Lewis family, not because of any specific evidence against them, but because in disappearances, the family is always the first group that needs to be clarified to rule out or confirm possible involvement. Daniel and Rebecca Lewis were interviewed separately according to standard procedure, with the goal of reconstructing in as much detail as possible what had happened on the morning Mark vanished, from waking up, activities in the house, to the moment Mark left adult supervision. The questions focused not only on the sequence of events, but also on emotional states, small habitual decisions, and things that at the time might not have seemed important. Interviewing the family in this context always involves a delicate balance, as investigators must maintain professionalism while facing the extreme pain and stress of loved ones fearing for their child's safety. However, that very psychological pressure can sometimes reveal small details that in normal circumstances might be hidden or not accurately recalled. Concurrently with working with the family, key witnesses and acquaintances with high access were also thoroughly interviewed, focusing on what they had seen, heard, or done during the critical time period identified by the timeline. These interviews were conducted as soon as possible to minimize the effects of fading memory or external information distortion, while aiming to detect inconsistencies that might suggest important details had been missed. When the statements were placed side by side and systematically compared, the investigators began to notice small inconsistencies, not large enough to draw immediate conclusions, but sufficient to warrant attention. Some inconsistencies involved estimated timing, the order of actions, or awareness of others' presence in the area, discrepancies that in many cases could be explained by stress and panic, but in an investigation could not be ignored. These inconsistencies were not treated as accusatory evidence, but recorded as points needing further clarification, because in a traceless disappearance, sometimes the smallest details play a pivotal role when placed in the full picture. Detecting these small inconsistencies also caused the atmosphere around the Lewis family to gradually change, as the initial community and authorities' sympathy began to mix with the necessary caution of the investigative work. The family, from the position of those needing support, gradually became subjects who had to re-explain every detail of their routine, a shift that was unavoidable, but also psychologically damaging. For the investigators, placing the family under suspicion did not mean concluding their involvement, but was a required step to ensure all possibilities were considered fairly and without bias. However, for the Lewis family themselves, the feeling of being scrutinized at their most painful moment added a new layer of pressure, making every word and reaction potentially interpreted unfavorably. In that context, the investigation entered a more complex phase, where the line between seeking the truth and harming those already suffering loss became fragile, and every investigator's decision had to weigh professional needs against psychological consequences. The results of the family and acquaintances investigation phase did not yield a clear suspect, but it clarified a reality. No statement was strong enough to completely rule out or definitively accuse anyone in Mark's close circle, while also showing that his disappearance could not be simply explained by an impulsive act or a clear mistake on the family's part. This very ambiguity, combined with the lack of physical evidence and the weakening of initial hypotheses, pushed the case into a prolonged state of tension, where the Lewis family was both the center of the pain and an inseparable part of an investigation growing increasingly complex and requiring more time to take another step toward the truth. When the investigation of the family and acquaintances failed to produce any clear direction strong enough to determine what had happened to Mark Lewis, authorities were forced to broaden their efforts horizontally, shifting from a focus on interrogation to mobilizing large-scale searches in the hope that the sheer space covered and the number of people involved could compensate for the lack of specific evidence in the early stage. This decision marked a significant escalation in the case, as it was no longer an internal matter for a neighborhood or a circle of acquaintances, but became a shared concern for the entire community and external support forces. Search and rescue units were mobilized, coordinating with local police to establish systematic search areas based on the disappearance range determined from the timeline, while gradually expanding outward in concentric circles. Hundreds of people, including officers, volunteers, and rescue personnel, participated in grid search teams assigned to specific areas to ensure no accessible locations that a 5-year-old child could reach were overlooked. In that context, specialized vehicles and tools began to be used, with search dogs playing a crucial role in scanning for scents and potential traces that Mark might have left. The dogs were brought to familiar starting points, daily routes, and areas considered high risk, in the expectation that they might pick up a direction of movement, even if only over a short distance. Alongside the use of search dogs, helicopters were deployed for aerial observation, particularly over dense forests, open fields, and terrain difficult to access from the ground, where a manual search could take a great deal of time or pose dangers to participants. The combination of aerial and ground searches aimed to create maximum coverage, but it also highlighted the limitations of these efforts, as time passed without any signs that Mark had ever been in the areas swept. The search focus gradually shifted to natural areas considered dangerous for a small child, including dense woods, bodies of water, steep slopes, and sparsely frequented spaces, because if Mark had wandered off on his own or met with an accident, these were the most likely places. Search teams had to contend with complex terrain, changing weather, and psychological pressure, as each cleared area yielding no results further diminished hope of finding Mark safely. With each passing day, the search perimeter was adjusted based on new information or reconsidered assumptions, but the result remained a worrisome silence from the field. While physical search efforts were pushed to the highest possible level, another information channel was opened and quickly became an indispensable part of the investigation: the public tip line. A hotline was established to receive any information related to sightings of Mark, suspicious individuals, unusual vehicles, or any detail, no matter how small, that could help shed light on the case. From the very first days, the tip line received a large volume of calls, reflecting the community's concern and worry, but it also posed a major challenge for investigators in filtering and assessing the credibility of the information. Every call had to be logged, categorized, and cross-referenced with what was already known, a time-consuming and resource-intensive process that could not be skipped, because among hundreds of inaccurate or irrelevant tips, there was always the possibility that a crucial detail was hidden. Investigators had to balance pursuing each lead against the risk of being drawn into dead-end directions, especially since some calls were driven by panic, imagination, or a desire to help rather than actual observation. When tip-line information was cross-checked against field data and the timeline, many initial leads proved inconsistent, leading to their elimination after verification, while others could not be confirmed due to lack of detail or supporting witnesses. This process, though necessary, gradually revealed the gap between the volume of information received and its actual value in advancing the investigation, leaving investigators with the feeling that efforts were spreading thin without producing a breakthrough. At the same time, the expanded search and tip-line operations had a profound impact on the Lewis family, as each new tip, even if unverified, sparked fragile hope only to quickly extinguish it if it yielded no concrete results. For authorities, the combination of large-scale searching and the continuous flow of public information initially created the sense that every possibility was being explored, but over time, as no clear signs emerged, the investigation gradually fell into a state of prolonged tension. Resources continued to be maintained, but effectiveness steadily declined, and every decision to continue or scale back efforts had to be carefully weighed in the absence of new evidence to guide them. At a certain point, though without an official announcement, a sense of stalemate began to spread within the investigation team, as the most viable options had been exhausted without results, and the remaining directions were either too vague or required resources beyond the capacity of a local unit. The expansion of the search and operation of the tip line, once seen as crucial leverage to find Mark, gradually became evidence of the limits of the initial efforts, as every action was carried out by the book, yet still insufficient to break the silence surrounding the boy's disappearance. It was in that context that the investigation began to enter a more difficult phase, where hope was no longer sustained by specific discoveries, but only maintained by the unresolved determination of those who believed that, even though every trace led to a dead end, the truth about Mark Lewis still existed somewhere beyond the reach of current efforts. After the phase of expanded searching and high-intensity tip-line operation, when all available resources had been mobilized, and most feasible investigative directions had been pursued without yielding concrete results, the investigation into Mark Lewis's disappearance gradually entered a worrisome state of stagnation, where no additional evidence emerged strong enough to alter the assessments formed in the preceding weeks. Key areas had been searched multiple times, search reports consistently returned negative, and public tips, though still being received, increasingly showed a pattern of repetition or lack of verifiability, forcing the investigation team to acknowledge that the incoming data stream was diminishing in practical value. In internal evaluation meetings, the lead investigator had to confront the key question not of whether any leads remained unexamined, but whether continuing to maintain emergency investigation status was still yielding returns commensurate with the resources being expended, especially as the local unit had to allocate personnel to other equally urgent cases. The decision to scale back resources, therefore, did not come as a sudden order, but as a gradual adjustment process, starting with reducing the scale of search teams, decreasing patrol frequency in areas already checked multiple times, and reassigning some officers to other regular duties. The use of costly assets like helicopters was terminated, search dogs were no longer deployed routinely, and off-site search activities shifted from proactive to reactive, activated only when new information deemed credible emerged. Alongside the reduction in field resources, the administrative workload related to the case increased, as all documents, reports, and data collected in the initial phase had to be systematized, organized, and archived according to procedure, ensuring that if the case were reopened in the future, all information could be retrieved and re-evaluated comprehensively. Mark Lewis's case file was completed with hundreds of pages of documents, including the constructed timeline, interrogation transcripts, search reports, lists of checked leads and eliminated hypotheses, all packaged as a detailed record of what had been done and what remained unanswered. The archiving of the file marked a significant procedural milestone, as the case was officially classified as unsolved and transferred to cold case status, meaning active investigation ceased, and any future activity could only be initiated if new information of sufficient value appeared. For the investigators, this moment carried an indescribable heaviness, because although they understood that shifting the case to cold case status was a necessary step within the system, it still evoked a sense of helplessness in admitting that the available tools and methods were insufficient to reach the desired answer. Many of them had been involved from the earliest days, had witnessed the shift from initial hope to tension, then to prolonged exhaustion, and closing the active investigation phase was akin to placing an ellipsis on a story not yet fully told. For the Lewis family, the impact of this decision was far more profound, as it was not merely a procedural change, but a shift in how they had to live with their loss. As search activities stopped and regular updates from police became infrequent, the family had to face the reality that they could no longer expect an imminent breakthrough, but had to learn to live in a state of indefinite waiting without a clear endpoint. They received no answers about whether Mark was still alive, or had met with misfortune, nor any evidence strong enough to help them form a clear narrative of what had happened, left only with vague assumptions and recurring questions in their minds. The case turning cold also altered the relationship between the family and the surrounding community, as the initial concern, though still present in the form of sympathy, gradually faded over time and was replaced by the town's return to everyday life. Those who had once participated in searches or called in tips now returned to their own lives, leaving the Lewis family in a quieter but more isolated space, where the pain was no longer widely shared as before. In that context, the absence of answers was not merely a lack of information, but became a prolonged psychological burden, as each passing day posed the same question that no one could answer with certainty. For the investigative system, shifting to cold case status was seen as a way to preserve future hope, since the file still existed and could be reopened if technology, witnesses or circumstances changed. But for the family, it was often felt as a door slowly closing, where hope had to be sustained by personal resolve, rather than concrete external action. The prolonged silence after active investigation ended, thus became an inseparable part of Mark Lewis's story, not as a conclusion, but as a vast void in the lives of those involved, where time continued to pass, but the question of the fate of that 5-year-old boy remained suspended, awaiting some moment in the future to be raised again, and perhaps answered. When the case officially shifted to cold case status and all active investigative activities ceased, Mark Lewis's story did not end with the archiving of the file but quietly branched off in a completely separate direction, detached from the town where he disappeared, and from the people still living in the space of unanswered questions. In the short period after the disappearance was no longer the focus of search efforts, Mark left the New Hampshire area, a move quiet enough to generate no signals that could be linked back to the suspended missing person case in the investigative system. The departure did not resemble a temporary trip or a journey, with a clear destination in the records, but was more like a severance, where all traces connected to the old place were left behind without creating easily recognizable links. In the new location, Mark began to exist under a different identity, a different name, a different story about his origins, simple enough not to arouse curiosity, and vague enough to avoid comparison with any records from the past. This new identity was not built on complete and transparent documents like those of a normal child, but on the minimal information necessary for Mark to appear in social life, without raising too many questions. For Mark, at an age still too young to understand concepts of identity or legality, this transition did not occur as a conscious event, but as a new reality imposed, where the surroundings gradually became normal, in the only way he knew. The caregiver played a central role in maintaining that reality, tightly controlling the information Mark was allowed to access about himself, his past, and the reason he was here instead of somewhere else. Any questions, if they arose, were answered in a consistent pattern, enough to soothe momentary curiosity, but not enough to open any door leading back to severed memories or connections. Information control was not limited to words, but also manifested in how Mark was introduced to the outside world, what was recorded in basic forms, and what was deliberately left blank or obscured to prevent tracing back. In that context, all contact with Mark's past in New Hampshire was almost completely severed, no calls, letters, or relationships serving as bridges between the two phases of life. To the outside world, Mark appeared as a child without a complicated history, carrying no missing person story, just a new individual in a different community, where no one had reason to suspect that behind that silence lay an unresolved past. However, the absence of ties to the past also meant Mark grew up in a state of legal record deficiency, as documents related to his birth, registration, and developmental tracking did not exist in the full and continuous manner typical for most children. This deficiency was not always obvious in the early years, because in the period from 2006 to 2009, document requirements for a child's daily activities were still relatively limited, allowing gaps to exist without excessive notice. Mark thus entered his early years under the new identity, with a sense of normalcy built from the repetition of routines and environment, even though its foundation was far more fragile than it appeared. For the caregiver, maintaining this state required constant vigilance, as a single exposed detail or question going too far could cause the entire constructed story to collapse. For Mark, that vigilance was felt not as a specific threat, but as an invisible framework, shaping how he interacted with the world, limiting what he was allowed to know, and what he was encouraged not to ask about. In the period from 2006 to 2009, Mark gradually adapted to this new reality, learning to exist in an environment where his identity was defined by what others told him, rather than by a process of self-awareness based on memories or personal records. Any fragmented memories from the earlier period, if they lingered, were not clear enough to challenge the new narrative, and over time they were pushed back into a hazy region of the mind, existing more as nameless familiar feelings than as specific images or events. Living under a different identity in these early years did not create immediate conflict, as Mark was still too young to recognize the gaps in his records, or the irregularities in how his past was recounted, but it laid the foundation for a life built on voids, where the most important questions were never answered, but only deferred. That deferral, combined with the complete severance from the original location, and from those who once knew who Mark was, created a unique state of existence, where he was fully present in his current life yet invisible to his own history, a condition that no one around him, including himself, could recognize the full consequences of at that time. Continuing the early years living under a new identity, when Mark had gradually become accustomed to existing within a story told by others instead of by himself, the new living environment began to profoundly shape the way he viewed the world and his place in it, not through dramatic events, but through the repetition of ordinary things that were nevertheless restricted. The place where Mark grew up during this period showed no clear signs of instability to outsiders. It was a quiet residential area where daily life proceeded according to familiar rhythms, and there were few elements that would prompt questions. However, within that very calm, the deficiencies in legal and social terms began to gradually reveal themselves, not as a specific event, but as a fragile foundation that always existed beneath all of Mark's experiences. The lack of complete personal identification documents did not immediately become a barrier in the early years of childhood, since many procedures could be delayed or handled in flexible ways, but it created a legally provisional state of living, where Mark could be present, but was not fully recorded in a complete manner. Important forms were left blank or filled in minimally. Information about personal origins was presented vaguely, enough to meet basic requirements, but not enough to create a seamless record over time. For Mark, this deficiency was not directly felt as a problem, because he did not know that other children usually had a clear chain of documents accompanying their growth process, but it quietly influenced the way he was accessed opportunities and the way the adults around him managed his life. Along with the vagueness in paperwork, unusual daily rules gradually became a familiar part of Mark's everyday life, even though they were not always presented as clear commands. There were things he was encouraged to do, and things he was implicitly understood not to ask about, topics that were quickly glossed over and stories about the past that were always kept to a minimum. These rules were not always enforced with strictness, but their consistency created an invisible frame of limits, where Mark learned to self-regulate his behavior and curiosity to fit what was considered safe in the surrounding environment. Gradually, Mark formed the habit of not asking too many questions about himself, not because he was not curious, but because he learned that asking questions often did not bring clear answers and sometimes came with evasion or topic changes from the caregiver. Those daily rules were also tied to limiting social contact, not through complete isolation, but by controlling the scope and depth of relationships. Mark could interact with people around him in certain contexts, but deeper relationships, where personal stories were often shared and compared, were not encouraged. Activities requiring long-term participation or attachment to a broader community were often restricted, making Mark's social world smaller and more closed than that of other children his age. This restriction did not always cause an immediate feeling of deprivation, because in a carefully constructed world, Mark still had moments of play and normal activities, but it reduced opportunities for him to compare his experiences with others and recognize differences that could lead to questions about identity. Over time, the combination of a controlled living environment, lack of complete personal documents, and unusual daily rules began to influence Mark's identity development process in subtle ways. He grew up with a vague sense of who he was, not because he lacked basic roles in daily life, but because the pieces that usually help a child understand their origins and place in the world were missing or blurred. The deviation in identity development did not manifest as rebellious behavior or clear crises in this phase, but existed as a feeling of not fully belonging, a hard-to-name discord between what he experienced and what he felt about himself. Mark learned to adapt to that feeling by focusing on the present, on specific and tangible things in daily life, while deeper questions about origins and the past were pushed below the surface of consciousness. For the caregiver, maintaining this state was both a goal and a challenge, as it required continuous control and consistency in how information was managed, while still ensuring that Mark could develop normally enough not to attract unnecessary attention from outside. For Mark, this childhood without records became the foundation for how he viewed himself and the world, a foundation lacking clear confirmation markers, but stable enough for him to continue growing, without realizing that stability was built on large voids. These years passed without leaving standout memories, or easily identifiable events, but that very absence was what shaped him most profoundly, because it caused Mark to enter the next phase of life with an identity formed in silence, where the most important questions had never been answered, but only systematically avoided. As Mark entered a stage of growing older, and gradually left the closed world of early childhood, the voids that had silently existed in the foundation of his life began to reveal themselves more clearly through increasingly frequent collisions with the formal systems of society, where every individual is identified, tracked, and recorded by files, data, and chains of information that require continuity. School records were where the signs of mismatch appeared most clearly and repeatedly, because Mark's learning process was not only tied to attending classes and studying lessons, but also tightly linked to forms requiring personal information, educational history, and family background. From the very first years of schooling in this period, Mark's records were unusually minimal, with many important sections not fully filled or only noted with general information, lacking the specific confirmation markers commonly seen in other students. These shortcomings were initially handled with flexibility by the school, which prioritized ensuring Mark could continue studying over investigating the origins of the administrative gaps, but that flexibility did not make the problem disappear. It only delayed confronting it. Over time, as Mark advanced grades or participated in programs requiring more detailed records, the old deficiencies not only remained unfilled, but piled up, creating a fragmented school record where each new school year relied on information that had never been fully verified before. For Mark, this gradually became a familiar but uncomfortable experience, as he realized that his record always needed explanation, always required adult intervention to get it done, while the records of friends around him seemed to flow smoothly without similar obstacles. Parallel to school records, Mark's medical records also began to reveal clearer contradictions as healthcare needs became more complex with age. Information related to vaccinations, medical history, and previous visits did not form a consistent chain, making each approach to the health system feel like a new start, where doctors or medical staff did not have a complete picture to rely on. In some cases, recorded information did not match between different facilities, creating questions that no one truly had clear answers for. Initially, these contradictions were explained as shortcomings in storage or by assuming old records had been lost, but as they repeated over many years, they could no longer be seen as isolated incidents. For Mark, each time he had to answer questions about his own medical history, without certain information to rely on, reinforced the feeling that his past was not recorded in a normal way, even though he was not yet able to name that abnormality. Administrative records, including documents related to residence, registration for activities, or identity confirmation in various contexts, also reflected the same issue of inconsistency, as Mark's personal information did not fully match across systems. There were small details that changed from one document to another, timelines that were not clearly confirmed, and items that completely did not exist in one record, but appeared in another, creating a patchwork administrative picture, enough to meet minimum requirements, but not enough to withstand thorough scrutiny. For the caregiver, maintaining this patchwork required continuous adjustments in how information was provided, with each new system approach requiring consideration of what to say, what to avoid, to prevent data cross-checking from exposing hard-to-explain gaps. For Mark, those administrative inconsistencies gradually became the source of unexplained questions, as he began to realize that the story about himself was not told consistently everywhere. The initial questions appeared very simple, such as wondering why some information about family or place of birth was always answered vaguely, or why there were documents he did not have while friends considered them obvious. However, as Mark grew older and his cognitive ability increased, those questions were no longer easily soothed by general explanations, but began to accumulate into a simmering doubt. What is notable is that in the environment Mark was living in, these questions were rarely confronted directly, but consistently avoided, causing Mark to gradually learn that digging deep into his past was not encouraged. That systematic avoidance did not make the questions disappear, but pushed them below the surface, existing as a nameless feeling that something in the story of his life was not entirely right. These mismatches did not appear as a single event, but repeated over time and in many different contexts, from school, healthcare to seemingly minor administrative procedures, forming a clearer pattern when looking back at the entire period. Each time a record needed supplementing, each time information was questioned, the feeling of mismatch was reinforced further, making the identity Mark was forming fragile and lacking a foundation of confirmation. The prolonged repetition of these mismatches also influenced how Mark viewed himself in relation to the surrounding systems, as he gradually formed the habit of accepting vagueness as a normal part of life, instead of seeking to clarify it. However, that very acceptance carried deeper consequences, as it delayed the process of confronting core questions about origins and identity, while creating a psychological foundation where inconsistency was seen as something one could live with. For outsiders, each individual sign of mismatch could easily be overlooked, since no detail was serious enough to trigger immediate intervention. But when viewing the period as a whole, they appeared as clear indicators of a systemic issue, an issue not just in lacking documents or conflicting information, but in Mark existing within a story about himself that had never been fully confirmed. These years thus not only marked the emergence of abnormal signs, but also the phase where those signs began connecting into a chain of repeated mismatches, quietly preparing the foundation for deeper suspicions. When Mark could no longer continue avoiding the central question, gradually forming in his mind, what truth was his identity built on, and what had been hidden throughout that time? Continuing the chain of mismatches that had silently accumulated in the previous years. The phase when Mark entered his teenage years marked an important transition, not because of easily noticeable surface events, but because of the change in how he began to look back at himself in relation to the surrounding world. As cognitive ability and comparison became sharper, but still placed within a tightly controlled frame. At the age when many children begin forming a clearer awareness of personal identity, family past, and their place in society, Mark continued to grow up in an environment where personal information was managed with extreme caution to the minimal level, enough to maintain daily activities, but never expanded to allow him freedom to query or verify. What Mark knew about himself was still presented according to a familiar pattern, repeated over many years without new details, making the story of his origins seem frozen, not developing parallel to his cognitive maturity. This information control was not only manifested through avoiding direct answers to questions, but also through how Mark was allowed access to documents, papers, and data related to himself, as most confirming information was out of reach, or explained instead of being allowed for review. In the teenage phase, as Mark began using more external information sources like school, friends, and media, that control had to become more sophisticated, no longer just refusing answers but directing questions, blurring the need to trace back, and emphasizing the present as a way to avoid confronting the past. Parallel to controlling personal information, Mark's access to the outside world remained systematically limited, not through clear prohibitions, but by gradually narrowing choices and opportunities, making paths to personal independence more distant than for peers. Mark's social relationships existed, but were not encouraged to develop deeply, especially those that could lead to sharing personal stories or comparing family experiences, because it was in such exchanges that differences in past and documents were most easily revealed. This contact restriction not only reduced Mark's ability to receive multifaceted perspectives from outside, but also reinforced his dependence on the version of information provided from within the caregiving environment. As Mark grew and began realizing that people around him could easily access information about their origins, family, and personal history, while he himself lacked the ability to do the same, suspicions about identity no longer remained just vague feelings, but began forming more clearly in his thoughts. Mark noticed that each time he tried to go against the provided information flow, the story immediately became inconsistent, or was blocked with unconvincing reasons, causing him to gradually understand that there were questions the surrounding system did not want, or could not answer. This increase in suspicion did not lead to immediate confrontational action, as Mark was still bound by legal, financial, and emotional dependence, but it created a growing inner distance between what he was told and what he felt might be the truth. In that context, the inability to trace origins became a structural obstacle, as Mark realized that even if he wanted to learn more about his past, he lacked the necessary tools to do so. The fragmented administrative records, conflicting information in school and medical papers, along with the lack of a clear confirmation marker for birthplace and biological family, made every tracing effort lead to a dead end, where questions were raised, but there was no foothold for answers. This helplessness not only caused frustration, but also deepened Mark's dependence on the only story version he had access to, even as he increasingly doubted its completeness. The teenage phase thus became a period of silent tension, not manifesting in major external conflicts, but occurring strongly internally, as Mark had to navigate between the desire to understand himself clearly and the limits set by the surrounding environment. Maturing under control not only affected access to information, but also shaped how Mark learned to self-censor his thoughts and questions, choosing silence over public seeking of answers, because he gradually understood that asking questions at the wrong time, or to the wrong person, could lead to unwanted consequences. Over time, this self-censorship became part of how Mark existed, causing him to develop high adaptability to the environment, but simultaneously delaying the process of forming an independent identity. When viewed from outside, Mark might appear as a relatively normal teenager, not causing trouble and not attracting special attention, but inside, he was carrying a set of unanswered questions about origins and identity, questions that became increasingly hard to ignore as he approached the threshold of adulthood. This phase ended not with an explosive event or a decisive decision, but with the accumulation of suspicion and feeling of limitation, creating a psychological foundation where Mark was more ready than ever to ask questions, yet completely lacking the tools and power needed to find answers on his own, a suspended state that would continue to shape his journey in the years to come. When the doubts about his identity had smoldered throughout his teenage years without being able to be resolved by any specific tools or records, Mark began turning to the only remaining reference source he could access, which was his own memory, though he soon realized that what existed in his mind was not a coherent story, but only scattered fragments, faint and difficult to piece together into a meaningful whole. Memories of childhood appeared without chronological order, often coming as fragmented images, fleeting sensations, or very small details, not tied to any clear context, making it impossible for Mark to determine which period of his life they belonged to, or what meaning they held in explaining the present. There were moments when he remembered a space different from the place where he grew up, roads, lights, or sounds that did not match the familiar environment. But each time he tried to hold onto or dig deeper into those images, they quickly faded away, leaving a feeling of emptiness rather than answers. These images were not clear enough to be called complete memories, but also not vague enough to be dismissed as imagination, creating a gray area difficult to define in Mark's mind, where he both believed they had real origins and had no way to prove it. The inability to connect those scattered images into a unified story caused Mark to fall into a repetitive state of doubt and self-questioning, as he did not know whether he was trying to recall something that had actually happened, or unintentionally constructing memory fragments from a prolonged sense of lack. Along with the vague images, Mark began to become more clearly aware of a feeling of not belonging that had followed him for many years, but only in this period was it named clearly in his thoughts. That feeling was not tied to a specific location or a clear relationship, but existed as a constant emotional background, making Mark always feel as though he stood slightly outside the shared stories of others, even though outwardly he still fully participated in social activities and daily life. When hearing friends talk about family memories, about stories passed down through generations, or about clear milestones in childhood, Mark realized that his own experience lacked similar anchors, making it difficult for him to firmly locate himself in the flow of time. This absence was not only emotional but also cognitive, because Mark had no verifiable data to compare with what he remembered or felt, no photos, documents or independent accounts reliable enough to confirm or refute the emerging memory fragments. Each time he tried to seek validation, Mark had to face the same barrier. All official information about his past was vague or contradictory, and the only people who could provide explanations either avoided the topic or repeated familiar stories that he increasingly felt were incomplete. This created a psychological loop difficult to break, where unconfirmed memories increased doubt, and increased doubt in turn made memories harder to grasp, because Mark did not know whether to trust his internal feelings or the information provided from outside. The internal conflict thus became a prolonged state, not erupting into a clear crisis, but always present as a silent pressure, forcing Mark to continually adjust how he viewed himself in order to maintain stability in daily life. There were periods when Mark tried to push aside the fragmented memories, convincing himself that they were not important, and that focusing on the present was enough to live a normal life. But each time he thought he had accepted that ambiguity, a small detail, a fleeting image, or an inadvertent question would pull him back to the initial state of doubt. This tug-of-war did not only occur in his thoughts, but also affected how Mark built relationships and future plans, because when uncertain about his past, he also found it hard to envision a future with a solid foundation. Mark realized that he was living in a story missing its opening, where the early chapters had been erased or replaced, leaving him with the responsibility of reconnecting the fragments himself without guidance or reference points. In that process, memory no longer served only as a tool for recalling, but became a battlefield where Mark had to confront prolonged uncertainty, as each attempt to connect the pieces risked deepening the internal conflict rather than resolving it. The lack of verifiable data not only made memories fragile but also weakened Mark's ability to trust himself, because he did not know whether what he felt held value as internal evidence, or was merely the product of a childhood shaped by information deprivation. This period therefore did not bring clear answers, but it marked an important shift in how Mark viewed the issue, as he began to understand that the fragmented memories and the feeling of not belonging were not random phenomena, but signs of a larger untold story. This realization did not immediately lead to action, because Mark still lacked the means and independence needed to pursue the truth, but it created a new cognitive foundation, where he no longer fully accepted the gaps as obvious, but began to see them as traces that needed decoding. The prolonged internal conflict thus was not only a source of unease, but also became a quiet motivator, pushing Mark closer to the point where continuing to live in ambiguity was no longer a sustainable choice, and the question of identity, no matter how difficult, would have to be confronted more directly in the next steps of his life. From the state of prolonged internal conflict and fragmented memories that could not be connected, a specific event finally emerged as a catalyst that made the doubts long smoldering in Mark no longer able to be pushed aside, because this time it did not exist only in subjective perception, but was triggered by an official administrative incident, where systems considered neutral and reliable unexpectedly reflected back the very gaps that Mark had tried to avoid for many years. That incident did not occur in a dramatic or sudden way, but began as a seemingly routine procedure related to verifying personal information for a practical purpose, possibly medical, insurance, or an administrative requirement, needing data cross-checking between multiple systems. In the process, information that had been entered and used before suddenly no longer matched, creating a series of questions that could not be resolved with the usual general explanations. Personal document contradictions appeared more clearly than ever, not just at the level of missing information, but at the level of opposing information, when timelines, places of birth, or background details could not be simultaneously confirmed from independent sources. Unlike previous times, where flexibility or overlooking could allow the process to continue, this time the mismatch had to be clarified for the procedure to be completed, placing Mark in a position to directly confront the question he had once postponed, whether the story about himself was truly based on verifiable facts or not. In that moment, Doubt about personal identity was no longer a vague feeling or an internal guess, but became a reasonable assumption supported by specific contradictions, recorded on paper and confirmed by the system's inability to create a unified profile for him. Mark's initial reaction was not panic or denial, but a familiar yet deeper feeling of emptiness, as he realized that what he had sensed for many years was not imagination, but the consequence of an incomplete information foundation. This administrative incident also led to indirect medical consequences, as the lack of a clear medical history complicated the evaluation and decision-making process, making Mark even more aware of the real impact of not having a seamless personal record. Previously, these contradictions could be seen as minor annoyances, but now they became concrete barriers to rights and choices in life, forcing Mark to seriously consider whether to continue accepting the ambiguity or start seeking answers. When document contradictions could not be resolved by avoidance, Mark for the first time faced an active decision related to his own identity, a decision no longer completely controlled by the surrounding environment, but by an internal need for clarity and autonomy. From here, doubting personal identity was no longer a passing thought, but became a structured line of thinking, where Mark began to consider the possibility that the story of his origins had been altered or concealed systematically. The decision to investigate origins was not made immediately as an impulsive action, but formed gradually through Mark comparing what he knew, what he remembered, and what the system could not confirm. He realized that continuing to live without answers not only caused psychological unease, but also created real risks in the future, as administrative, medical, and legal procedures increasingly demanded higher transparency. The cognitive turning point occurred when Mark understood that investigating origins was no longer a choice of personal curiosity, but an essential need, so that he could build a stable and autonomous life. This realization did not come with anger or an immediate desire for confrontation, but with a cold sobriety, as Mark began thinking about how to approach the issue in the most practical and safe way. He understood that asking questions the wrong way, or too soon, could lead to information channels being closed, so the decision to investigate origins was formed as a cautious plan rather than an emotional reaction. In this process, Mark also had to face the fear that discovering the truth could bring unwanted consequences, not only for himself but also for current relationships, because the truth, if it existed, could shake the entire structure of the life he was familiar with. However, that fear was not strong enough to stop the newly formed determination, because Mark realized that not knowing who he was, and where he came from, had become a greater burden than any potential risk. This cognitive turning point did not end with a specific answer, but with a change in how Mark viewed himself, as he no longer saw ambiguity as the default state to accept but as a problem to be solved. From that moment, every mismatch in the past, every fragmented memory, and every administrative contradiction no longer existed in isolation, but were connected into a logical chain, showing that there was another story behind his current identity. The event that triggered doubt, therefore, was not just a failed procedure or a system error, but the moment Mark shifted from passive to active, from enduring uncertainty to being ready to confront it, marking the point where the question of origins could no longer be postponed, but became the center of the next journey in his life. From the moment he decided not to avoid the question of his own origins anymore, Mark began approaching modern tools that had previously been out of reach, and among them, DNA technology emerged as the most feasible choice for seeking an objective anchor, because it did not depend on administrative documents that had proven unreliable, nor on subjective memories that were fragmented and contradictory. The generation of DNA data occurred in a context where genetic analysis services had become common, easily accessible, and used by many people as a way to explore family origins or health history, making this action not attract special attention from outside, but hold extremely great significance for Mark. When the DNA sample was collected and sent for analysis, Mark did not expect a specific result, but viewed it as an experimental step, a way of questioning reality in the language of science, rather than feeling or speculation. However, the returned results did not fall within that vague expectation range, as the automatic matching system showed unusual genetic connections that did not fit the story about family and origins that Mark had heard for many years. These results not only showed a lack of match, but also pointed to genetic relationships with individuals who did not appear at all in Mark's current life, opening the possibility that the identity he carried did not accurately reflect his biological origins. Initially, Mark approached this information with extreme caution because he understood that DNA data, though scientific, still needed to be interpreted in the correct context to avoid hasty conclusions. However, as the unusual matching results continued to appear, reinforcing each other rather than contradicting, they began to form a clearer pattern, showing that Mark had blood ties to a different family branch, in a different location, completely separate from the story he had lived for nearly 2 decades. It was at this moment that DNA data no longer served as a personal discovery tool, but became a potential bridge between Mark and some missing person record existing in the system, though not yet clearly identified. The process of linking to old missing person records did not happen instantly or automatically, but required the intervention of experts with access to appropriate databases, because comparing DNA with child missing person records is a sensitive process, strictly managed and requiring a high level of verification. When the initial results were taken seriously, the possibility that Mark could be a child missing in the past was no longer posed as a far-fetched hypothesis, but as a scenario needing official verification. The genetic data was compared with national and state databases storing information on unresolved missing cases, and it was during this process that important matching points began to appear, connecting Mark's DNA sample to a child missing person record from many years earlier in New Hampshire. This linkage was not considered conclusive evidence immediately, but was a strong enough signal to activate a strict chain of identity verification procedures, including reviewing old records, comparing timelines, and assessing the compatibility between biological data and previously recorded information. For Mark, the moment of realizing that he might be the missing child in an unresolved case carried a complex mix of emotions, not just shock or confusion, but also the feeling that the doubts lingering for many years had finally found a reasonable explanatory framework. However, instead of bringing immediate relief, this information opened a new phase full of uncertainty, as Mark had to face the possibility that his entire life had been built on an identity that did not reflect biological truth. On the side of the authorities, when the DNA data and unusual matching results were transferred, they immediately attracted the attention of units responsible for unresolved cases, because an adult having DNA matching a missing child is a rare but particularly significant scenario. Activating identity verification was not just an administrative procedure, but the restarting of a case that had been frozen for a long time, requiring coordination between investigative units, forensic experts, and data management agencies to ensure that all conclusions were based on a solid foundation. This verification process took place step by step, from checking the accuracy of the DNA sample, ruling out possibilities of error or technical mistakes, to comparing biological timelines, genetic characteristics, and background information with the original missing person record. Each step was carried out with a high degree of caution, because the consequences of a wrong conclusion in this case would affect not only Mark personally, but also the biological family of the missing child, and the entire integrity of the investigative system. When the initial verification layers yielded consistent results, the official investigation direction began to be reopened, no longer just revolving around the question of who Mark is, but expanding to what happened in the past to lead to the current situation. The reopening of the investigation direction was not announced widely immediately, but was conducted in a narrow scope to protect information confidentiality and the psychological safety of those involved, especially Mark, who was processing an amount of information far beyond what he had ever prepared for. In this context, DNA not only played the role of scientific evidence, but also as a catalyst changing the entire story structure, shifting it from a personal identity search journey to a larger-scale legal and investigative case. For Mark, the DNA turning point in 2023 marked the first time in his life that an objective data point stood on the side of his internal doubts, confirming that the feeling of not belonging and the fragmented memories were not products of imagination, but traces of a truth that had been buried. For the investigative system, this was the moment when an old record, once shelved due to lack of leads, unexpectedly received new life from modern technology, showing that no matter how much time had passed, unresolved stories could still be brought back to light when the right tools finally appeared. Immediately after the official investigation direction was reactivated from the DNA turning point, the entire process of confirming Mark's identity shifted to a completely different phase, where every conclusion had to be built on a foundation of multi-layered, rigorous, and independent verification to ensure that the confirmation was not based on sentiment, expectations, or public pressure, but purely on scientific data, temporal logic, and systematic exclusion. The primary focus of this phase was in-depth DNA comparison, far beyond the initial suggestive match level. Mark's DNA sample was reanalyzed multiple times, not just in one laboratory, but through various independent units, using separate methods and algorithms to ensure result consistency. This was done to eliminate any possibility of technical error, sample contamination, processing mistakes, or subjective interpretation, because in cases with such significant legal and humanitarian consequences, even a small deviation could lead to serious outcomes. The repeated results showed genetic similarity far exceeding the threshold for random coincidence, especially when compared to data from close blood relatives in the old missing person file, strongly reinforcing the hypothesis that Mark was not only biologically linked, but almost certainly the same individual as the child who disappeared many years earlier. However, the authorities did not stop at DNA, as they understood that human identity cannot be confirmed by a single factor alone, no matter how reliable it is. Therefore, the next step was a comprehensive comparison of other biological characteristics, including stable genetic traits over time, such as facial bone structure, ear shape, body proportions, eye color, hair growth pattern, as well as congenital marks or personal features recorded in the initial file of the missing child. This data was compared with images, descriptions, and archived documents from many years prior, not to seek absolute similarity, but to assess overall compatibility when placing the two individuals at different points in life on the same biological development axis. The experts involved in this process clearly understood that maturation can significantly alter external appearance, so they focused on factors least affected by environment and age, thereby building a more valuable comparison model. The comparison results showed a high degree of compatibility, not just in a few isolated features, but in the entire biological structure when considered holistically, further reinforcing the conclusion that these two identities did not exist in parallel but were in fact one and the same. Parallel to the biological comparison, timeline matching of growth and life events was implemented as a third pillar of the confirmation process, because DNA and morphology only answer the question who, while the timeline answers how. Investigators conducted a thorough review of the entire timeline from the moment the child went missing to the present, comparing it with Mark's biological age, the stages when he appeared under a new identity, gaps in administrative records, and unrecorded movement milestones. When these data fragments were overlaid, a logical timeline began to form, in which Mark's early years with incomplete records significantly overlapped with the period immediately after the disappearance, and his appearance in a new environment occurred precisely around the time when the official search had ended. Importantly, there were no serious contradictions between Mark's growth timeline and the old missing person file, a key factor in ruling out the possibility that these two stories merely coincided by chance. To ensure absolute objectivity, an indispensable step in this process was ruling out random coincidence, even though the probability had already been assessed as extremely low. Statistical and forensic experts conducted probability analysis based on population data, the prevalence of detected genetic markers, and the likelihood of another unrelated individual having the same level of match. These analyses showed that the probability of random coincidence was negligible, especially when considered in the context of other factors such as timeline, administrative records, and biological characteristics, all converging on the same conclusion. Ruling out randomness was not only scientifically significant, but also a legal requirement, as it protected the integrity of the conclusion against any future challenges. When all layers of verification were completed, and no significant contradictions remained, the authorities reached the official confirmation that Mark was indeed the missing victim from many years ago, and that he was still alive. This confirmation was not announced hastily, but was recorded through legal documents and internal minutes, reflecting the consensus of multiple specialized units, after a prolonged and cautious evaluation process. For Mark, the moment his identity was confirmed carried a feeling beyond mere surprise or simple relief. It was the simultaneous collapse and restructuring of his entire self-perception. The years of doubt, fragmented memories, and sense of not belonging no longer needed self-justification, but were validated as the natural consequence of a concealed truth. Knowing that he was the surviving victim of a disappearance not only answered the question of identity, but also forced Mark to confront the reality that his life had been shaped by unwanted decisions from very early on. For the investigation system, confirming a living victim marked a rare turning point in cold cases, where the story did not end in tragedy, but opened an entirely new chapter, with the focus no longer on searching, but on clarifying responsibility, motive, and the chain of events that allowed a child to vanish from the system for many years without detection. The identity confirmation thus was not the end point of the story, but the door opening to larger, deeper, and more complex questions, laying the foundation for the next phase, where the truth not only needed to be acknowledged, but also confronted, explained, and handled fully in both legal and human aspects. Immediately after Mark's identity was confirmed, through rigorous scientific and professional verification layers, the case that had lain dormant for many years was officially transferred to the unit specializing in unsolved files, marking a fundamental change in the legal and investigative status of the entire story. The cold case unit took over the matter not from a zero-start position, but with a massive amount of historical data accumulated from the initial investigation phase, now placed in a completely new context with the victim confirmed to be alive. This takeover involved a thorough review of the entire original file, from the first scene reports, witness statements, search results, to decisions to reduce resources and archive the case, with the goal not only of understanding what happened, but also of determining why the case reached a deadlock, and what opportunities were missed given the limitations of that time. The cold case unit investigators approached the file with a different perspective from their predecessors, as they were no longer influenced by urgent time pressure or lack of leads, but could review the entire process with the advantage of temporal distance, new technology, and a confirmed outcome regarding the victim's existence. In reviewing the initial investigation, every hypothesis raised in the days, weeks, and months after Mark's disappearance was reanalyzed, not to judge right or wrong, but to assess their fit with what is now known. Hypotheses previously dismissed for lack of evidence, investigative directions once deemed unfeasible, and minor details once considered irrelevant, were all brought back to the table, because in the new context, those elements could carry entirely different meaning. In particular, investigators focused on re-evaluating the professional decisions that led to the case becoming cold, examining whether any information gaps stemmed from resource, technology, or investigative method limitations of that era. Reevaluating old hypotheses went beyond rereading documents. It included cross-referencing them with Mark's reconstructed growth timeline to determine which hypothesis could reasonably explain his disappearance while still alive, and which became incompatible in this context. Hypotheses involving accident or the victim no longer being alive were quickly eliminated, while those involving removal from the area, identity concealment, or information control began to be considered more seriously, as they could explain both the investigative gaps and Mark's life in subsequent years. The cold case unit also re-examined how information was collected and processed in the early stage, including assessing witness statement reliability, the possible existence of unrecorded information, and the impact of public attention on the investigation's direction. Building new investigative directions was not done in isolation, but based on combining historical data with newly confirmed modern information, creating an approach that both inherited and innovated. The focus of the new direction was no longer where Mark went, but who removed Mark from the system, how and what context, and why it could occur undetected for many years. Investigators began re-identifying the list of individuals who had potential access to Mark before and immediately after his disappearance, cross-referencing them with the new timeline and identified movement milestones to find intersection points possibly overlooked before. At the same time, modern investigative methods, including data analysis, cross-administrative record review, and exploitation of new databases, were employed to search for traces that old technology could not detect. Reopening the cold case was not merely an administrative decision, but a comprehensive restructuring of how the case was viewed, where all old assumptions were allowed to be challenged, and every direction had to be proven with specific data. For the cold case unit, the greatest challenge lay not in lack of information, but in classifying, evaluating, and connecting a large volume of data spanning decades, while ensuring every step strictly adhered to current legal standards. For Mark, though not directly involved in professional decisions, knowing that his case was being officially reopened brought a feeling of both relief and anxiety, as the truth was no longer an abstract matter for speculation, but was being systematically pursued by authorized individuals. The cold case reopening phase thus became a bridge between past and present, where decisions made many years ago were re-examined in the light of new truth, and where the investigation was no longer limited by what was not found, but guided by what was ultimately confirmed, paving the way for a journey to clarify responsibility and context of the entire matter in subsequent parts. Continuing the process of reopening the file and building new investigative directions, the cold case unit began delving into a sensitive but unavoidable task, re-examining all the blind spots in the initial 2006 investigation, not to assign personal blame, but to understand the decisions made in the context of that time, and how those decisions inadvertently created gaps lasting many years. The analysis of 2006 investigative decisions was conducted systematically, starting from the first hours after Mark was reported missing, when time pressure, lack of information, and community expectations forced investigators to act quickly based on the most common assumptions of that era. Original reports showed the initial focus heavily on the possibility of Mark wandering off or meeting an accident near the residence area, a reasonable approach for a young child, but one that simultaneously reduced priority for other scenarios, especially those involving Mark being taken away from the area in a very short time. When initial hypotheses yielded no results, the investigation expanded, but the lack of physical evidence and limited supporting technology meant many directions could not be pursued fully, leading to exclusion decisions earlier than necessary from the current perspective. The cold case unit analyzed each decision milestone, from search area delineation, witness statement evaluation, to the point of resource reduction, to determine if any signs were undervalued or overlooked because they did not fit the dominant hypotheses at the time. In this process, linking old and new data played a pivotal role, as what was once seen as irrelevant or insufficiently significant in 2006 could carry entirely different meaning. When placed alongside DNA data, the reconstructed growth timeline, and later discovered administrative records, investigators cross-referenced old reports with newly rebuilt timelines, searching for intersection points where a minor detail once dismissed now became noteworthy under the light of confirmed truth. This not only helped clarify what happened, but also understood why some investigative opportunities were missed, not due to negligence or lack of responsibility, but due to objective limitations of the system and knowledge at that time. Missed opportunities were analyzed frankly yet cautiously, including the inability to cross-reference federal data in real time, lack of expanded DNA databases, and heavy reliance on witness statements in a context where human memory is easily affected by time and pressure. The cold case unit also re-examined how conflicting statements were handled, assessing whether any contradictions once deemed insignificant actually reflected information incompleteness rather than dishonesty. Re-examining these blind spots was not aimed at pointing out specific errors, but at adjusting current professional judgment, ensuring the reopened investigation did not repeat old thinking patterns that could lead to the same dead end. Investigators acknowledged that in 2006, the concept of a child being taken and living under a different identity for a long period without detection was not considered as seriously as today, partly due to lack of precedent and partly due to lack of verification tools. Adjusting professional judgment thus included expanding the hypothesis scope, accepting scenarios once seen as too complex or improbable, as long as they could reasonably explain existing facts. In that context, the system's limitations at the time were recognized not as justification, but as a reality to be understood to avoid unfairly imposing modern standards on the past. Information technology, interagency data sharing capability, and awareness of crime patterns involving identity change had advanced significantly in nearly 2 decades, making many current tools non-existent or unavailable when Mark disappeared. The cold case unit used this understanding to fully restructure the case approach, ensuring new analyses were based not only on modern data, but also placed in appropriate historical context. The process of re-examining investigative blind spots thus became an important intermediate step, helping connect the two investigative phases separated by many years in a continuous and consistent manner. For current investigators, acknowledging and analyzing old limitations did not weaken prior efforts, but instead created a stronger foundation to move forward with the necessary clarity and flexibility. For Mark, though not directly involved in professional evaluation, knowing that the gaps in his life were being examined seriously and systematically brought a feeling that his story was no longer left to ambiguity, but was placed in a responsible process of understanding. This phase concluded not with a specific discovery, but with a profound adjustment in how the case was viewed, where existing blind spots were named, analyzed, and integrated into the new investigative direction, setting the stage for clarifying the specific actions that led to Mark's disappearance and existence outside the system for many years. A process that would continue to be explored in depth in the subsequent steps of the reopened investigation. Continuing the effort to re-examine investigative blind spots and adjust professional assessments, the cold case unit shifted its focus to the most sensitive task since the case was reopened, tracing backward the origins of how Mark was removed from the system, a process that required a delicate balance between gathering evidence, legal evaluation, and protecting the rights of the now adult victim. Investigating the caregivers became the central axis of this phase, not with a default assumption of guilt, but with the goal of determining their actual role in the chain of events that led to Mark living under a different identity for many years. The investigators began by reconstructing a complete profile of the person or persons who directly cared for Mark after the time he disappeared, including residential history, social relationships, sources of income, and how they explained Mark's appearance in their lives at different points in time. This information gathering was conducted through administrative records, residency data, voluntary statements, and secondary sources, all aimed at building a comprehensive picture of the context into which Mark was placed and maintained. In parallel, the cold case unit analyzed the legal role of the caregivers in each phase, examining whether any adoption procedures, guardianship, or legal authorizations had ever been established, and if so, when, with which agency, and based on what information. The analysis revealed significant legal gaps, as the caregiving relationships existed primarily in practical life without being fully recorded in the system, creating a gray area where legal responsibility was difficult to clearly define. It was within this gray area that questions about abduction or aiding and abetting began to be raised cautiously, but unavoidably, because the fact that a missing child could be taken and raised for a long period without legal records raised the possibility of intentional concealment or at least a systematic disregard of reporting obligations. The investigators carefully considered the elements constituting abduction under the law, including the deprivation of the biological family's legal custody rights, the victim's intent at the time of the incident, and the degree of initiative by the involved parties in changing or concealing identity. At the same time, they also assessed the possibility of aiding and abetting, where an individual or group did not directly carry out the removal but assisted, facilitated, or turned a blind eye to maintaining that unlawful situation. This evaluation was particularly complex due to the passage of time, the potential fading of memories among those involved, and the fact that many actions, if they occurred in the specific social context of that era, might be viewed differently today. To avoid speculation, the cold case unit focused on evaluating existing evidence, classifying it by levels of direct, indirect, and circumstantial, to determine what facts could withstand legal scrutiny. The evidence examined included residency data showing Mark's movements and stability under the new identity, administrative forms with conflicting information, statements from people who had contact with Mark and the caregivers, as well as documents showing efforts, or the absence of efforts, to legalize the caregiving relationship. However, although the overall picture became increasingly clear in descriptive terms, transitioning from description to prosecution faced significant gaps, as many key actions in the early phase were not recorded with clear physical or documentary evidence. This prosecutorial gap became the central challenge of the investigative phase, as the investigators had to acknowledge that establishing historical truth does not equate to the ability to prove criminal liability under current standards. Many key questions, such as the circumstances under which Mark was taken, who initiated it, and whether there was criminal intent from the outset, could not be answered conclusively based solely on available data. The cold case unit therefore had to continually adjust investigative expectations, clearly distinguishing between illuminating the story and reaching the evidentiary threshold for prosecution, two goals that do not always align. In this process, the investigators also had to consider the psychological impact on Mark, who had only recently had his identity confirmed and was processing the emotional consequences of discovering the truth about his life. Approaching Mark as an adult witness or victim was done with utmost caution, avoiding pressure or forcing him to relive memories whose accuracy he himself was uncertain about. At the same time, the cold case unit had to work closely with legal advisors to ensure that every step complied with victim protection principles and did not harm the potential for future case handling. The phase of tracing the origins of the removal thus did not yield a simple conclusion or a clear perpetrator, but exposed the complexity of a case spanning many years, where the boundaries between criminal acts, neglect of responsibility, and personal choices in a context of inadequate oversight became difficult to delineate. For the investigative system, acknowledging prosecutorial gaps did not mean failure, but reflected honesty in assessing the limits of evidence and law. For Mark, this process brought a different form of truth, not a simple answer about who was right or wrong, but the understanding that his removal from his original life was not a random accident, but the result of a chain of actions and decisions that occurred in the shadows of the system. This phase ended in a state of limbo, where many questions had been raised and partially clarified, but the path from historical truth to legal accountability remained fraught with challenges, laying the groundwork for subsequent developments as the case moved closer to the moment of confrontation between past and present. From the limbo state of tracing the origins of the removal, where historical truth gradually emerged, but legal accountability still had many gaps, the case progressed to a phase decisive for Mark's life, completing legal verification and officially closing the identity confirmation process on the state's behalf. Relevant agencies coordinated to conduct a final review of all DNA matching results, biological data, and growth timeline, ensuring that every necessary legal criterion was met before issuing the final confirmation, as any error at this stage could have long-term consequences for Mark's rights and legal status. Completing verification was not just an administrative procedure, but an official acknowledgement that Mark was the individual reported missing many years earlier, and entitled to all rights and obligations tied to that true identity. Once this conclusion was issued, a series of subsequent processes was activated to adjust Mark's personal documents, from updating civil registry records and correcting information in administrative databases, to handling documents previously issued under the old identity to avoid future legal conflicts. This adjustment process occurred step by step, involving multiple agencies, as Mark's life over nearly 2 decades had been tied to an inconsistent document system, and transitioning to the true identity required caution to avoid disrupting essential rights, such as healthcare, education, employment, and residency. For Mark, this was a phase both liberating and challenging, as he saw his real name appear consistently on official documents for the first time, but also had to confront the reality that many parts of his previous life needed restructuring to align with the confirmed new identity. In parallel with completing legal procedures, the most profoundly human turning point occurred: the reunion with his biological family, who had lived without answers for many years since reporting their child missing. Arranging this meeting was done with extreme care, involving psychologists and counselors, to ensure that both Mark and the family were adequately prepared to face a moment filled with conflicting emotions. The meeting was not designed as a public or symbolic event, but as a private space where people separated by time and circumstances could face each other in safe, supported conditions. For the biological family, seeing Mark alive after many years was not only indescribable joy, but also brought the pain of lost time, memories of a vanished child, and years lived in fragile hope. For Mark, the moment of reunion was not simply a return, but a complex experience where biological connection coexisted with estrangement in lived experience, as he had grown up in an entirely different context. The encounter therefore was not an emotionally complete endpoint, but the beginning of a longer process where relationships needed rebuilding from scratch, not based on shared memories, but on accepting the present and desiring to understand each other now. In those initial moments, there was no immediate integration or full explanations for what had happened, only the presence of people sharing a truth long delayed. As the official verification phase closed, the case entered a new state, where the question of whether Mark was alive had been definitively answered, and the focus shifted from identity confirmation to how Mark would live with that identity in the future. For authorities, completing verification and supporting reunion marked the end of a long investigative chapter, while opening responsibilities for post-verification support to ensure Mark was not abandoned again in an overburdened system lacking accompaniment. For Mark, ending the confirmation phase did not mean all questions were answered, but the termination of a prolonged suspended state, where he lived with an unconfirmed identity. Now, despite much still unclear about the past and the responsibility of those involved, Mark could for the first time stand on a solid legal and social foundation, with his real name, real history, and official recognition that he had existed, been missing, and been found. The reunion thus was not only a physical coming together, but a reconnection between a person and his life story, where the past, though unchangeable, was finally acknowledged, laying the foundation for a next phase, no longer dominated by identity ambiguity, but by Mark's own choices in building the future from this new starting point. Immediately after the legal verification phase closed, and Mark was officially recognized with his true identity, a sense of apparent completeness began to emerge in public perception, and among those directly involved, that the nearly 2-decade missing person case had finally been resolved. But it was precisely at that moment that deeper questions arose, forcing the legal and social systems to confront the reality that resolving identity does not equate to resolving the entire case. No one doubted who Mark was or that he was alive, as the most core elements of the puzzle had been confirmed by science and legal procedure. But the rest of the story, the part involving responsibility, motive, and the chain of actions that caused a child to disappear from his former life, did not reach a similar conclusion so easily. Identity resolution provided a clear, tangible conclusion, one recordable on paper, databases, and investigative files. But the criminal case behind it existed in a far more complex gray area, where factors of time, evidence, and legal limits intertwined in ways that prevented a decisive answer. Authorities had to acknowledge that although Mark's removal from the system had been clarified factually, determining specific criminal responsibility faced barriers nearly insurmountable in the current context. Unclear criminal responsibility stemmed not from lack of suspicion, but from lacking the elements of crime provable beyond the legal threshold after so many years, when many key actions occurred outside system recording and left no sufficiently strong physical or documentary evidence. Those involved in the past may have acted in the legal gray areas of that era, when regulations on reporting, guardianship, and identity verification were not as strict as today, making retroactive application of law difficult or infeasible. Even when actions were seen as morally or socially wrong, converting them into criminal charges required a level of proof that investigators could hardly achieve after nearly 20 years. Especially with fading human memories, incomplete witnesses, and significantly changed context. Thus, the open question was not whether Mark was taken, but whether that act could and should be prosecuted as a crime under current legal frameworks. For many in Mark's biological family, the absence of clear criminal accountability created a sense of incompleteness, as if justice had been only half served, truth acknowledged, but responsibility undetermined. For Mark, the question carried a different nuance, as he not only faced the reality that his life had been directed by others' decisions, but also had to accept that the system might not deliver a punitive conclusion commensurate with what occurred. Current legal limits became the key factor shaping how the case was viewed post-identity confirmation, as law must operate within frameworks of evidence, statutes of limitations, and specific proof standards, rather than emotion or desire to compensate for past losses. Prosecutors and investigators had to weigh pursuing a prosecution with high failure risk against acknowledging that the system cannot always provide complete answers to every historical injustice. In that context, Mark's case existed in a special state, viewed as resolved at the identity and personal status level, yet seen as not fully closed at the responsibility and justice level. This contradiction was not the fault of any individual or specific decision, but a consequence of how legal and investigative systems operate in reality, with unavoidable limits when too much time has passed. Looking back at the entire process from the day Mark disappeared to the day he was confirmed and reunited with his biological family, one is forced to question the definition of a resolved case. Does it require only answering where the victim is, or also determining who is responsible and how? In this instance, the answer seems to lie in between, where truth has been illuminated enough to close a major chapter, yet leaves gaps unfillable with current tools. Acknowledging that the case cannot be fully resolved does not diminish the value of what was achieved, but honestly reflects the system's limits when facing prolonged complex cases. For Mark, this means continuing to live with part of the story lacking clear closure, where identity recognition provides a foundation for the future, but cannot entirely erase questions about the past. For society, the case offers an uncomfortable but necessary lesson: finding the victim, alive or not, does not always come with traditional legal justice, and truth and justice sometimes exist in orbits that do not fully overlap. It is in that intersection that the question, was the case truly resolved, has no single answer, but depends on whether one views it through the lens of facts, law, or human experience, a choice that will continue to shape how this story is remembered and retold in the years ahead. From the unresolved question of whether the case was truly resolved, long-term consequences became clearer as Mark's story shifted from investigation to real life, where the impact of nearly 2 decades of disappearance was no longer abstract but specific, profound, irreversible changes for the people and systems involved. For Mark, the greatest consequence lay not in whether identity was confirmed, but in having to restructure his entire sense of self, while living with gaps lacking complete answers. Being recognized as a living victim of a disappearance brought certain relief, but also placed Mark before the challenge of reconciling 2 parallel lives, the one under the old identity, and the one under the true, without clear boundaries to fully separate them. The lost years could not be compensated by any legal procedure or media attention, and Mark had to learn to accept that his coming of age had been shaped by unwanted choices, even as he now had greater self-determination over the future. Psychologically, knowing the truth was not the end of healing, but the start of another phase, where Mark faced complex emotions like anger, regret, confusion, and loss for a childhood he never truly lived. For the biological family, the consequences were distinctly dual: joy at reuniting, after many years coexisted with pain over lost time and realization that the relationship could not return to its original state. Reunion did not erase years lived in waiting, doubt, and fragile hope, but placed the family in a new process of rebuilding connection with Mark on the foundation of the present rather than interrupted past memories. At the same time, the family faced the reality that the legal system might not deliver clear criminal conclusion, forcing them to find personal closure rather than awaiting punitive judgment. For investigative work, Mark's case became a typical example of both the capabilities and limits of the system, showing that modern technology, especially DNA, can open doors thought permanently closed, but also emphasizing that time can erode the ability to pursue traditional accountability. Successfully reopening and handling a cold case at the identity level was a significant achievement, affirming the value of maintaining complete records and readiness to revisit old cases with new tools. But it also raised questions about balancing truth-seeking with ensuring justice when evidence is no longer strong enough. From a professional perspective, this case prompted internal self-assessment among investigative agencies, encouraging reconsideration of initial assumptions, broadening scenarios considered in child disappearances, and stressing the importance of interagency data connection to avoid prolonged gaps. Lessons from Mark's story apply not only to one case but serve as reference for many others, especially those with ambiguous identity signs or lacking clear legal records. Recognizing that a victim could live for years under a different identity forces authorities and communities to rethink how they evaluate cases without clear evidence of death, while encouraging hypothesis expansion rather than premature narrowing. The case also highlighted the growing role of the public in providing DNA data and related information, as tools once exclusive to authorities have become part of civilian life, creating new possibilities, but requiring careful management to avoid misuse or misinterpretation. On a broader level, Mark's story delivered a profound message about how society views resolution in long-term cases, reminding us that finding the victim, alive or not, is only part of the process, and that justice, truth, and healing do not always converge at the same point. Sometimes, a case's greatest meaning lies not in a pronounced sentence or identified perpetrator, but in the system's and community's ability to learn, adjust, and prevent similar tragedies. For Mark, the ultimate meaning of this journey may not lie in fully explained past, but in moving forward with recognized identity, restored choice, and truth on the table, even if incomplete. For the family, community, and investigators, this story became a reminder that every unresolved file represents a life in limbo, and that persistent storage, re-examination, and not closing too soon can make a decisive difference, even after decades. It is in the intersection of loss and hope, limits and progress, that the consequences and significance of Mark Lewis's case lie, not only in a missing child found as an adult, but in forcing us to rethink how society confronts unfinished stories, and our shared responsibility to ensure those gaps are not forgotten, simply because they are difficult. In American life today, Mark Lewis's story reminds us that safety is often just a feeling, especially in quiet towns like Laconia, in 2006, where families trusted familiar communities. So one moment of hesitation over an unfamiliar detail was enough to create a few minutes gap, and that gap swallowed 17 years. The first practical lesson is to turn safety into structured habit. With young children, always have a clear handoff point between drop-off and pickup. The key witness in this story lacked a two-way confirmation mechanism, so when Mark left supervision, no one knew the exact moment to react. The second lesson is to respect data as part of well-being. Mark grew up with minimal school records, conflicting medical records, inconsistent administrative papers, repeated yellow flags that those around him overlooked. In today's American life, if a child, or you yourself, frequently encounters paperwork issues, mismatched vaccinations, or personal information varying across forms, it is not just inconvenience. Proactively ask until resolved, request record copies, cross-check, and seek help from appropriate agencies. The third lesson is that technology is only effective when people dare to use it at the right time. DNA in 2023 unlocked the case's blind spot, but it only appeared after Mark chose not to avoid it, and actively sought his origins. In American culture that values autonomy and individual rights, this translates to a reminder: when intuition and data both signal something wrong, act early. Keep records, create family safety plans, and do not hesitate to tap community resources before everything slips into the silence of a cold case. If Mark Lewis's story makes you rethink what can be missed in the most ordinary moments, please subscribe to the channel to join us in continuing to follow other untold complete files. Thank you for accompanying us to the end of this journey, and see you in the next video, where every story can serve as a real-life warning.